We'll just start by a quick little introduction in terms of what we've all been working on. In my background, I guess I'll start first. We'll keep these brief so we can save time to get into the nitty gritty. But basically, I worked at Demmissie and Yahoo Finance and quit because of what I believe is pretty much the most exciting wave in technology ever in bringing community together to achieve things together. So launched a community-owned crypto show right now called Coinage. And I have basically bet my career on this space, and I think a lot of us have as well. Amanda, Lule, and Chika have very different experiences in different projects, but Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I've also bet my career on this space, but if things fall through, I could go back in the open job market, which would be all right.
Yeah.
But I started working on Ethereum in 2015 and was chief marketing officer at Consensus, which played a big role in bringing Ethereum to market. I built the first Web3 marketing team in my role there. And then after 4 years, started a company called Serotonin, which has grown to become the largest Web3 marketing firm. We also have expanded into other professional services, and we've spun out several products from our product studio, starting last year with Mojito, which is the leading NFT e-commerce backend used by Sotheby's, CAA, and others. And this year, a company called Franklin, which is Web3 crypto native payroll. And we have a third one in the works that we'll be probably launching next year.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lule Demmissie. I'm the US CEO of a company called eToro, which is an online trading platform for individual investors. We have assets that are ranging from just classic capital markets access, fractional shares, stocks, ETFs, but also have a wide array of digital assets that we offer our customers. We also have a nonprofit that is a digital asset that allows for universal income distribution, which is does some really interesting purposeful work in the digital asset space that I think is a very important use case to solve, which is the need for universal income. And really just came to crypto by way of being in finance for many years. I was in traditional finance, running different kinds of investment businesses. And about 3 years ago, really saw the light in terms of how blockchain and smart contracts were going to transform our industry, not just our industry, but our economy, and the opportunity for capital formation in communities that didn't have it before. So I was really excited to be in this space and glad to be here with you today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chika, and I am the co-founder of Afropolitan, and we are building the first digital country for the African diaspora, and also known as the network state, which was coined by Uwazie. And so I've been in tech for over 10 years. This is my second startup. First did a startup in HR tech, so completely in a different industry, but I truly believe that Web3 is the future. And I always tell people that I believe Web3 was made for Africa. The reason why we are building a digital country is because we feel that the nation states across Africa have failed, and we have a huge potential. So if we look at the diaspora, they send about $70 billion every year back to Africa. And so our strategy is to take on that economy, right? And if we put it in a treasury, that could be really powerful. And the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that globally, Nigeria is the third largest adopter of cryptocurrency as well. So there's so many different things that we're looking to launch, whether it's through the investment ecosystem, the developer ecosystem as well. And so this is a long-term project for us. We are looking to build this digital country first online and then eventually through land, but I'm super excited because it's never been done before. So I'm really excited just for everything that we're learning on the process as well.
I don't think I undersold what I said when I said I was really excited about this panel, because it's big ideas and it's things like that. I mean, Chika, we can start with that because I feel like it's a good example of how big some of these ideas are in Web3 and what really it is when it comes to aligning interests from people really all over the world to kind of get those interests aligned and then have the NFTs represent ownership and everything like that. I mean, how do you even start an idea that big? And like, what's, I guess, the takeaway when it comes to anyone watching what's playing out in Web3?
Yeah. So a funny story is me and my co-founder, we were in Senegal, right? And so we read an article by Uwazie called How to Start a New Country. And so he talks about like the old ways of starting country, like through war, revolution. And then he basically said, but I believe that we can start a new country through blockchain technology, right? And pretty much creating these nodes all over the world and having it digitally recognized as a country. And so we read the story and like, oh, that's really cool. But like at the time, it didn't really click until December. And so my partner woke me up at 5 a.m. and he was like, we need to start a new country. And I was like, at 5 a.m.? Okay. But honestly, just through reading and just reflecting, Afropolitan is actually is in a premier events organization. So we've been doing events since 2018, primarily focusing on the African diaspora, and we also do events on Africa as well. And then when we started looking at the data, we realized, well, yes, there's a huge crypto adoption across Africa, specifically Nigeria, where I'm from. There's a potential to actually give ownership and governance back to the people, because the main challenge right now is that people across Africa don't feel like I have a voice. Every year, the elections are happening, and sometimes the person I vote is not the person coming in, right? And a lot of times it's being rigged. There's a lot of people who are just there forever and they're not leaving. And so there's all these different, challenges. And so we said, how can we actually finally unlock that? And so, our first stage is, and we're doing it in 4 phases, is to do an NFT project, right? And these NFTs will serve as a passport into this digital nation that we are starting. We're starting the community, even though we have a community of about 200,000 people, we're starting it actually start small. Because we also realize that we're still learning about DAOs, we're still learning about NFTs, and so we don't want thousands of people trying to learn all at the same time. But we're dropping these passports, and what we're also doing is, if you've read The Network State, Uwazie talks a lot about how people need to deeply believe in this community, right? And it can't be transactional. So we have created a whole mythology. And it's an African mythology, really talking about how Africa was once abundant. And I think the theme with the NFTs is that you can't know where you're going unless you know where you come from.
Right.
So we created this whole story, and we're going to spend pretty much a year kind of sharing and doing the storytelling of that.
That's what's kind of interesting. I mean, I guess for anyone who kind of first looks at NFTs or Web3 and, the first big spike with digital art and profile pictures, I think anyone might see that and walk away and say, okay, that's all NFTs are, is digital art. And then you start to realize it's the story. And Amanda, you probably know this better than anybody here in terms of like actually communicating it to an audience and, doing that as a Web3 studio. But I mean, how big is that challenge when you're trying to communicate what may have already been implanted in their heads to think about NFTs only as digital art? Now, as we see the next evolution of, no, this is how you align community around a shared mission and a shared goal, has it become, I guess, more difficult for anybody trying to do this now? Or is it kind of slowly people realize the technology, and then once you figure out how to actually buy or sell an NFT, you're kind of golden because you know how it works?
Yeah, I think most people are interested in actual use cases and aren't necessarily interested in how things work. We, turn on a light switch, but very few of us could actually construct an electrical system or a light bulb. We use the computer and the internet, but very few people know or care how TCP/IP works. It's not a prerequisite to know or care how something works to actually use it. And so people will mentally latch on to the use cases that are closest to them. And the PFP and fine arts use cases got a lot of attention this cycle, and I think they'll continue to be important and interesting. We actually worked with Sotheby's on their Web3 transformation, which landed them on the Time list of 100 companies that matter most. They did an extraordinary job, and I'm excited to watch that use case continue to flourish. But what we're seeing now are lots of membership cards. We saw Starbucks yesterday launch their membership card. We're seeing NFTs used in rewards programs. And over time, as more different NFT use cases emerge, I think it'll become clear that similar to the internet, Web3 isn't a given set of outcomes or final destinations. It's a substrate for building things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can build all kinds of different things with it. It's a substrate, it's a clay, you can mold it. It has these characteristics. Depending on what kinds of outcomes you want to incentivize, you can use it to make incentive alignment engines. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is. It's a substrate for building incentive alignment engines. And what communities are in Web3 is collapsing the traditional categories of builder or team or company, user or customer, consumer, and investor into a single economically aligned category that we call community, for lack of a better word. That can sound kind of twee sometimes, but it is the best word, I think. for that collapse of those categories. There's no need for a bright line anymore between those categories, because someone who's a user could contribute to the open source code of a project or contribute to the marketing of a project. Someone who's invested in the project and has a positive, financial outcome that they could achieve, they're going to want to help with it as well.
Yeah.
Someone who's the team or the builder, they might totally decentralize their entity and get rid of their legal entity and decentralize into a DAO. And so there might not even be a holding wall of a company for them to work in. So those categories are just getting mushed. And that's what's going to happen with Web3. It's not a single destination. It's the substrate to make that, all those new kinds of organisms.
Yeah, I think it's pretty exciting. And obviously it's like, what we're trying to do with the show is you kind of break down the wall between an audience and then they become your co-owners, co-producers. They help you make a better show. So for me, it makes sense in media because you can basically create a better product. And I think that's true across every sector once you figure out a way to use your customer rather than a means to an end, but just actually as the end in and of itself, you can make a much better product. But Lule, I'd be curious to get your take too, because we're obviously at SALT. There's a lot of financial curious minds here.
Yeah.
And when we talk about, I guess, maybe looking at blending all of those things across investor and, customer and user and all of those things, obviously from a regulatory perspective, sometimes old systems need to learn about the new system and the new system needs to learn about the old system as well. So, what do you see kind of when it's all playing out that way?
I think, what made it more complex, frankly, is my biggest fear is that this cycle of the winter that we're in might slow down and snuff out the individual sort of formations of community and individual engagement. And so that's one of the reasons I often speak at events, is because I'm such a champion of making sure that community formation doesn't get slowed down. In so many ways, when you were talking about that, I was thinking to myself, Web3 is the African wheels, because as an African, I hear you speaking like that's the African diaspora culture. This idea of collapsing of lines for the interests of different parties being able to be in the same ecosystem and benefit from it. And I think that's what's so exciting about this space. So as an investor, I'd say, my whole thing is it is really important for individuals to remain in this space, not just institutional dollars, because individuals are what bring that sort of the vigor of a use case, right? At the end of the day, they're the ones who sniff out use cases earlier than most individuals and communities, right? They sniff out use cases faster than most other places. They're also the force multiplier of use cases. And so I think one is, just making sure that the engagement of the individuals remains. But the other is like understanding that beyond the collapsing of universes of interests, the other thing that's so fascinating about this space for me is the opportunity to create capital formation, like just as we were just talking about in this case. So many different ways. So eToro has a nonprofit called The Good Dollar. One of the founders is actually in the room here, Anna Stone. And its premise, it's the #1 universal income digital asset, and it has over 500,000 members, and issues out about 50,000 people benefit from the Good Dollar. So essentially an investor benefits from it in terms of a store of asset and a capability to be able to have that asset appreciate. But that percentage of asset then is distributed to people who are in communities. And what we know about digital asset consumers is that they end up being force multipliers in their communities, right? So not only do they benefit from this UBI in the case of the Good Dollar, but they end up being force multipliers in their communities in terms of creating ecosystem of Good Dollar economies, being able to educate the people around them, starting small businesses. To me, that is what's so fascinating about this space, is that, capital formation in different pockets of our planet is a necessary next step in the evolution of humanity.
Yeah.
And so I do think that that's the promise of Web3. And so as investors, I find it exciting just to be able to be on that ride as a holder of a store of asset. But I also, as an individual who has the background that I do, I'm also really excited about the ability to have capital spread all over.
Yeah, I mean, Chika, you use the example of like waking up at 5 a.m. and just being like super excited about this. I mean, Lule, as you're talking about it, like that to me is the force multiplier of it all, is the most exciting piece, because it's like, sure, anyone can have a lot of money and have a goal in mind, but without the other people coming along who want to help and build and achieve that mission, it doesn't really work. So you kind of need that piece. And I feel like that's sometimes the hardest piece for anyone trying to create a community in Web3, is finding that alignment and really attracting the right crowd And I don't know if there's, for all of you, one example that kind of stands out if you think back to when it all clicked for you. I think for a lot of people watching, Constitution DAO was kind of a funny thing because in a few days they were able to raise $45 million to go try and buy a replica Constitution. But on paper, it was kind of like a joke and a lot of people were laughing at it, but it got a lot of news coverage. And I think a lot of people started to realize, okay, a shared idea like that can raise quite a bit of money. And then if it's a bigger idea and you take a little bit longer than just a few days, you can really start to achieve stuff. I don't know if there was a specific example for each of you, maybe not, that kind of triggered something like that to you when you saw it come out.
Yeah, I would even go back to, so when we had this idea, we were in Nairobi, right? And what was interesting is we still had the rest of our trip to go to different parts of Africa. So me and my partner were like, okay, you know what? Let's ask a bunch of people, does this sound crazy? And if enough of them say yes, then like there's something here. So we ended up going right after Nairobi, we went to Zanzibar, right? And we spoke to some people there over dinner. And they're like, it sounds crazy, but actually like with blockchain, something could happen, right? And then we went to Accra, then we went to Nigeria. And honestly, the biggest testament to our idea was just that fact that the first $1 million was actually raised from these community members. So it was angels, it was founders, it wasn't any like institutional money at that point. And I think that's what validated that, as crazy as it sounds, like I want to start a new country, right? The fact that people really bought in. And I think also it was a great story when we started talking to VCs, because what we shared was that the community invested in this, right? So like from the ground floor, the people that are actually invested in what we're doing is people that are part of our community, people that we believe represent Afropolitan. And these are people who have founded startups. These are people who are in music. These are people who are creative. So it's not even just one type of profile, but all different types of profile. And we were also very intentional to make sure that every single person represented all parts of Africa and all parts of the world, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, is it only for Black people? I'm like, no, because first of all, in Africa, there's all types of people in Africa, right? And so we had to make sure that that was representative of the world we're trying to build.
I would actually double down for mine on Constitution DAO, which we were very close to through our partnership with Sotheby's. And I was presenting about kind of what happened with that to a team of Sotheby's executives afterward. And the point that I wanted to kind of drill down on wasn't that they were able to get all of this enthusiasm and all of this value toward bidding on the Constitution, or that they lost. The most interesting part for me was that after they lost, what they did was they allowed everybody that had contributed to take their money back out. But not everybody did. And the people token, it was called people, all in uppercase, the fungible ERC20 token of that DAO continued to have value even after they lost, because not everyone withdrew and people continued to trade it and it had economic value. And the thing that's interesting there is that community on Web3 intrinsically is valuable, even if the actual object they were trying to achieve didn't happen. And so it's almost like the value that you can attribute to like a CRM, but at scale, and that you've accumulated this group of people, you've collected them so they can take some kind of action together. And that thing now has cell walls around it, so you can ascribe monetary value to it and bring it into fungibility and bring it into trade with other types of monetary value. So what we're doing is really putting cell walls around types of value that weren't in the economy before, and adding all this new value because we're putting cell walls around it so that it can come into trade with other types of value. And that type of value already existed out in the market. It just didn't have a cell wall that could come around it and capture it so it could interact with other cells. And that's what we're doing with this substrate.
It didn't have the rails to access to capital and access to connections, right? And I think you're absolutely right. It's not one particular project per se, but this formation of this organism that becomes more and more of a force multiplier. And I think that that is what the promise of Web3 and sort of just smart contracts in general have. You asked what was the moment. For me, it was actually not necessarily one particular project, and it was more about when I heard, I'm originally from Ethiopia, I'm married to a Filipina. When I heard how many people sent money over, because remittance is one of the largest form of GDP contribution in many countries, right? Through wallets. I was like, what? And then I went a year ago, and how much business is done through transacting through wallets. And so, like, for instance, crypto in general is about, like, I think Ethiopia is like the number 8 economy in Africa that uses it. So I think in general, there are use cases that are happening. They're may not be as apparent in the US, but they're happening everywhere else. And I have no doubt that happening, those cell walls you're talking about, are going to create other ideas that will create cell walls in this country and many other places, because it's too appealing, this unpacking of the power of community and the ability to create connective tissue around it, to not only monetize it, but to be a force multiplier on many fronts. Sometimes it's about an issue, right? As we saw, for example, with meme stocks, right? Yeah. It wasn't necessarily about the value of a particular stock. It was about, like, this is my outlook on things, and who are you to tell me that I cannot move this, right? And so it can read as ego, but I think that would be an oversimplification of the conclusion of the era we're living through, which is, I think it is this formation and the power of communities that are turning into organisms.
Yeah, I think for me, it's interesting. And People Token's a good example, because I think I put $300 into Constitution DAO as a flyer, and then it wound up, it wound up being like $5,000, I think, at some point. I didn't necessarily take all out, though, because there is an interesting thing when you think about community and buying into something. It becomes more a part of you than, I think, just buying a stock. And I think the meme stocks are a good example of that, too, because you saw on the flip side, the company trying to buy some shares and you might get a free popcorn, and trying to, like, tap into, it seemed very Web3 to me, seeing that play out. Yeah. And I think probably it confused a lot of traditional stock owners and investors.
Absolutely. And it's confusing to people that it's still around, right? They're like, wasn't there a bubble? Didn't it burst? Yeah. And they're like, what the heck is Bed Bath & Beyond doing?
But that's what's interesting about it, because you stick with it, and it becomes like you meet people on the Reddit forums and you're like, all right, we are now AMC for life.
The thing that I love that you said that I wanted to double down on is that the most important movement of assets isn't actually financial assets, it's talent. And that's the staying power of the space. Because when an individual commits their career, as we all talked about kind of doing, to this, that has more staying power through market cycles than an actual given asset. And so as I see more and more professionals coming into the space and identifying themselves as, I'm going to be the blockchain gal, the blockchain guy in my organization if they work in a big company, or I'm in college and I'm starting something on the block. You're seeing more and more people commit, and that's the asset class I'm looking at.
Yeah.
In the beginning of trying to form the ecosystem around Ethereum, our motto was developers, developers, developers. Because in those early days, we wanted the developers because then we'd have more at-bats to build apps that people would end up using.
Yeah.
Now we're starting to really have the developers. A lot of people know Solidity, a lot of people know LLL, and we're getting to the point where, well, not that many people know LLL compared to Solidity, but some do. But we're starting to get to the point where we need everyone, and we need professionals in order to move their industries into it. And that's the biggest cool indicator that I've been seeing that weathers any market cycle.
Absolutely. I agree.
And I really want to speak to this talent piece specifically, because I think another thing that's been really bringing me joy is that for Africans, this Web3 has been a way to unlock a new opportunity that they would never have, right? So, across, I would speak specifically for Nigeria, a lot of, for example, universities are shut down for various reasons. And so people are like, I don't want to stay idle. Like if you go to Lagos, like the ambition is like rising off the streets, right? So people are like, I don't want to stay idle even if I can't be in school. And I've seen a lot of Nigerians enter NFTs. So even the artist we're working with, he's never left Nigeria, but his art is being seen globally, right? And people are buying his art globally. And that is an opportunity that was unlocked just recently, right? I've seen, even when I speak to different protocols, so like the Graph, I just did an interview with them, and he was saying his biggest developer ecosystem outside of the US is actually Nigeria, which I was shocked about, right? And even some other, like Solana, some other, organizations have mentioned the same thing. So like beyond just financially, a lot of talent is being unlocked, especially for emerging markets, even if they don't have opportunities in a traditional industry, but now they're able to just figure it out, go to YouTube, be part of a DAO, they learn and educate themselves, and now they can actually enter the system as well.
Yeah, I feel like, we spent a lot of time talking about community so far. The other one is building access, right? And I feel like a lot of the access pieces, like you don't know any of this stuff is even happening unless maybe you've dabbled with even holding crypto. And maybe it was just the prospect of making a lot of money that maybe sucked you into the ecosystem and said, oh, I'll buy some Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever. But then, then you start to know how to use it, and then it unlocks everything else that we've been talking about. But when it comes to broadening access, I'll just play devil's advocate for the other side, just to make this panel fair for anyone watching, and might say, well, is that community aspect maybe potentially problematic when we think about what has happened with some projects? And for our media, for our show, Coinage had the first exclusive with one big project, Terra, that had failed and I think hurt a lot of retail investors. And some people just couldn't sell, myself included, because they had believed in the mission, basically, that it was. And when you think about these things being fungible and, and tradable, and when you're thinking about community versus investor, and you blend those lines, sometimes the other side can trade against that and have the advantage if they are only looking to make money and don't care about the mission or community. And that is one piece that I think is intriguing when we're talking about this in a financial context.
Yeah.
That could be maybe a problem.
I think that is definitely a moral hazard, but it is not a reason not to embrace the future, because I don't know how we create more equitable capital access without embracing this new phenomenon of community that's unpacked with connective tissue to it. I think the beauty of a lot of what blockchain offers us, though, is so much of it is transparent, right? I think that in the old days, right, it's Tammany Hall days, and so much of it happened in the dark. And the beauty of code is that it's going to be visible and transparent. So yes, the damage might be done, but you will also be able to do the retro, if you will, on what happened, right? I think also the other thing is, one of the things as a digital platform provider, I often tell people is you don't have to invest in anything. You can also track it, right? So there's a way for us on our platform where I track 10 coins, but I invest in 3, right? And so there's a way for you to be able to engage without necessarily putting capital at risk, but still so we have a social feed. I still benefit from looking at the social feed about what people are saying about those projects, right? I'm still intellectually going for the ride. I sometimes say to myself, wow, I missed that ride when I see how much I'm tracking. But for me, it's not only just about, I think looking at this purely as a means of investment, although I know we are in an investment environment, would be shortchanging the future. I think eventually the investment side will kick in for sure. But I think, like all investments, the seed of it is a transformation of something. That's something that our technology has done, right? Nobody knew what would happen when Web 2, Web 2 has expanded our imagination of what could be. And I cannot see what else but Web 3 will do for that as well. And so to my mind's eye, the investment part of it is a foregone conclusion. It's more just about time. But I also don't think it's in our interest to say this project is going to be a guarantee in 5 years. It's just not an old enough space to put that kind of classic asset allocation and market theory around it. But it is definitely promising enough for smart money not to be in it. And so I think that we're in that weird middle ground. And I think the challenge and the complexity for regulation is how to create these boundaries that help us limit the moral hazard without clipping the wings of the future, right? I think that, there's no doubt in my mind that in the US, if it's embraced, it's another bridge towards the hegemony of the US dynasty, right? Like the same way that .com, unleashing .com did for the US dynastic sort of power, I think this could. So the wisdom of how we regulate is going to be important in terms of how we still remain relevant in this space.
I think that's a pretty important point, specifically just because it is tricky. And I don't know if you guys also ran into all kinds of regulatory issues. I'm sure if you're dealing with a bunch of different countries, it's got to be a nightmare. But even just trying to figure out in the US, you can ask probably 20 different people and get 20 different answers for how to set up an entity in Web3. And a lot of them might say, go offshore and don't worry about any of it. But we didn't necessarily want to do that. We wanted to figure out a way. And it took months of working with a bunch of lawyers to figure that one out. But I do feel like that is something that is pretty important when it comes to this staying in the US and being something that is there. I know you're kind of working across the globe, but I mean, how do you even handle some of those questions when even the regulators don't even know how to start?
Yeah, to be honest, and probably the main question I get is around Nigeria. because like even, we were talking about this earlier, because Nigeria put out there, we're banned crypto, which is kind of confusing because when you land in Lagos, the biggest banner is a crypto banner. So it's like, okay, it's banned, but yet like it's all advertised all over the place. But what I will say is, at least recently, there has been conversations with the government because for the first time, at least in Nigeria, tech has flipped oil as far as investment coming into the country. And so now, CBN, our central bank, and some governors and senators are like, okay, there's something going on in there, so we can't ignore it, forever. And so there are questions around that. But I feel like it's just really staying close to what's happening, speaking to different people in the place. And I think it's important that we champion people who really understand the space to be close with the government. I don't think, I don't think we can live in a world where we say like, well, anti-government, or we're not going to listen to government. Like, it's still there. We still operate, in this realm. So I feel like it's making sure that the right people are in the room and really just educating, because what I'm also seeing is that it's more of that they don't understand, right? And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I feel like broadening access is the core, like that's the core for all of it. It's not just regulators trying to understand it, but I feel like it's retail, anyone who's dabbling in this. And we've seen some interesting projects built around just pure education. Jack Dorsey and Jay-Z working in Brooklyn, also not too far from here, trying to help people understand some of this stuff too. But I feel like, maybe it's because the use cases early on weren't exactly, and I don't want to throw shade at any one particular project, but when we're dealing with things called crypto dick butts and other things like that, sometimes it might be hard for people to take anything seriously. But I mean, I don't know if that's a thing that just takes time, or if it is maybe net positive. Lule, like you said, it's anyone who wants to be curious about this stuff can go and access it openly. You don't have to worry about any gatekeepers, really, like some of the other stuff when it's overregulated and more of a nanny state. Yeah. So I don't know, maybe that's the way that it should be.
I mean, I personally think that we're going into a time when we all need to become more resilient. And the systems that are operating in our world now operate at such a scale that things can break and become really drastically bad pretty quickly. And so we're going to need to decentralize our energy systems. We're going to need to decentralize all kinds of different activities, right? It's not just crypto. And individual people have shown that they have the capacity and have the interest to become investors, and to learn about investing, to custody their own funds in their own custodial wallet, as opposed to, depending on a bank or depending on a government. You see with things like GameStop, or you see with things like Robinhood, that the average person doesn't want to be excluded from the opportunity to get into the best investments. One of our earliest clients at Serotonin was Republic, which is allowing anybody to get into private investments, because the founder of that company noticed that when Google went public, it was mostly super rich people that were accredited investors that made the most money, and retail investors weren't making the most money from that. So there's part of democratizing access is actually holding some tension against those boundaries that prevent people from accessing the best investment opportunities. And where I think we're going is a world where all of us are going to be part builders and creators, and are going to be part investors. And that's just going to be something that we all do. All of us need to learn how to custody our own assets and take care of our own value. We should know how to, the same way we should know how to cook, the same way we should know something about farming, maybe, in case things really hit the fan.
It's a good, I'm speaking in front of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus on exactly that problem when it comes to like education for, if you don't know how bad the old financial model is for a lot of specifically minorities in the US, then you don't know kind of what crypto and what some of these other things could do. Yeah. If it's a solution. And so it's tricky because we don't even talk about it.
That minority claim is a ruse, because I can tell you, I was driving through Vermont and I saw a lot of people who were excluded that were not minority in a classic sense. So I think the dirty little secret is capital is still held by, it's not even a secret, it's a very out loud secret. So regardless of your color. That's why I'm saying what's so exciting about this is, I do believe in capitalism. So I do believe in free enterprise. And what's so exciting about this is, without necessarily sacrificing that thesis, it is creating rails for capital formation. which is what capitalism is all about.
Yeah.
And so what's so exciting to me is that it is essentially making communities owners of their own goods and services and consumers of it, right? And creating a mechanism and the rails for investors to come in and water that lawn so it becomes a force multiplier, and then eventually profit from it as those communities rise, right? I want to just make a comment about what you said about, how can people take seriously with some of the ridiculous stuff we saw recently? I don't know, maybe it's because I grew up in so many different places. I just feel like we all have to be a little less fragile and just be, that's what bringing people in the room looks like.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not like working for your taste, but we have to be careful to not let our cultural fragility make us miss some really interesting leaps that are happening in social and economic trends, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a little silly, but you know what? I'm all about vive la différence.
To be clear, I don't want to. I mean, I was proposed about a crypto dip last night.
But I just in general, I think I would hate. I remember when I was at Bitcoin Miami this year, and I was like, wow, like this is what crypto looks like. The entire globe, the entire political spectrum, the entire everything. It's just this goulash. And it would be a shame if that was not still, because that is the force multiplier, right? So we have to be careful in productizing this space, that we don't snuff out the very thing that is going to be its force multiplier.
And I'll even add further that, I think what's interesting about this space is that for the first time, people are really being held accountable because it's so transparent. Like one of my favorite projects is Azuki, right? And, that was a shit show. Zack, the whole unveiling. But what was interesting was, yes, that he was put out to dry to a certain extent because of, some people felt some type of way of that he had other projects and there were considered rug pulls. But then what I liked was that the community rallied around him, right? And really, held him accountable, and he now had to come out and be very transparent, even talks himself. And so I really like that, even when, certain projects go bad, that the community kind of rallies around and even kind of forces the mechanism for the truth to come out. Yeah. Even another project as well. So I spoke to a lady who wasn't the founder of the project, but they made her CEO of it because of some shady dealings that happened with the actual founding team. So the community voted to bring in a new CEO, right? And in a company where, it's been around for maybe 20, 30 years, and let's say maybe something was going on in the top, it wouldn't be that easy to put in a new CEO or putting a new set of executives, right? Yeah. But now with some of these NFT projects, the community has a voice and they can say, I don't like that, right? And they can vote and create a change. So I do like that transparency and giving the community the real voice that I think is needed.
I think it goes back to aligning incentives too. And, we did that at Coinage too. NBC is a former employer of mine, so I got to be careful about what I say. But there are plenty of examples in media where power without checks and balances in kind of the way that it's structured around incentives, if the audience has no voice or if the public has no voice in some of these decisions, Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer, things like that happen for a reason, I think. And that's not what this panel is trying to get into. But when we set our thing up, it's exactly that. It's accountability. And if the community controls this stuff and it's built as a cooperative, then I should go if people don't like me as a host, or if I'm not doing my job, vote me off the show kind of vibe. Because I think it is those incentives when they are aligned that kind of makes this all a little bit more democratic and makes the product better and doesn't allow people, to use your words, get away with shady stuff, because that's not good. But I do think that that's kind of, to wrap up, because we only have about 6 minutes left, but when we think about the most powerful things and the takeaways from anyone who's been listening to this panel or curious about Web3, for what it changes about the old system. We've talked about a lot of different things, but I think, the next 5 years as we look ahead, what you're most excited about when it comes to, if this is just the start of what this technology is unlocking, where you see it going. And I think, Chika, you have a pretty big vision, so we already know what you're going to say about where this goes, but those little steps along the way that make it, I think, clear to a wider audience.
Yeah, sure. So there's this question of the next 100 million users that comes up a lot. Where do they come from? What kinds of products do they use? What rails do they come in over? And in the very beginning of the crypto movement, we saw value moving from fiat currency into usually investment in Bitcoin over rails like superhighways like Coinbase. And that was how the value moved. that's not what's happening anymore. What's happening now is that there are all these capillaries. There are all these kinds of side doors of people coming into specific projects that speak to them because maybe they're a fan of a certain restaurant. Maybe they are part of a certain neighborhood group that has a DAO. Maybe they have a retail brand that they love that's now selling an NFT or allowing you to engage with your favorite artist in a new way. We've done a lot of this work working with brands that are getting into the space that have their own fan bases and their own audiences that they're bringing in. And so what we're not going to see is just a ton of investment coming in over the superhighways of the past. We're going to see individuals that are accessing use cases that are more proximal to them, that have to do with the things they want in their day-to-day life. And those buyers are going to come in with different motivations. So they're not, often a criticism of the space is that there's so much speculation, but what the space really is that that's no longer a problem because you're collapsing the different incentives. You're collapsing the investment incentive with the building, with the community incentive. So it's a bit of an uninformed critique, I think. But I think nonetheless, we're going to start seeing more and more NFT holders and fungible token holders buying them because they want utility.
Yeah.
And they're going to be more likely to buy those things than a physical version because they know that they could sell it. So they're not consuming their value, they're parking their value somewhere. And so people are going to be incentivized to buy these kinds of assets over the assets in the physical world. And then the sellers are incentivized to create them because the products are instantly global. There's no supply chain. There are almost no upfront costs. It's a non-cannibalistic product line that they can add on in addition to their existing brand, in addition to their existing product lines without, harming them. There's every possible incentive. So I think, every time we've seen this in the past where there's this huge incentive to move it forward, it happens. And that's how I think this is going to play out in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and I think I agree. I do think, though, the ease of access of those highways, it's too early to tell whether they're not the highway yet, because I feel like there are two things that are happening that have put them on ice. As sure as there's a winter, there's a spring, right? Mm-hmm. So we're in a winter, and you can't measure life just through winter's life glasses, right? And I do think, though, whether it's individuals or institutions having access to being able to buy it as a storative asset. And I think speculation is a bad word, but there's nothing wrong with being able to say, I believe in this, and it may not last forever, that belief, but I might be able to sort of have a momentum trade around it. I'm an all of the above kind of investor.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little early because of the fact that we're in a winter, so it's hard to know what the future holds. And then the second is what the regulatory landscape holds. If the regulatory landscape has the imagination to create what they did during the .com, right? When they came in and they leveled the playing field and leveled the structure so there was enough regulation, but at the end of the day that those companies could thrive. If we find that Goldilocks, and better than we did with .com, but if we can find that Goldilocks without snuffing out innovation, but leveling the playing field, I think these superhighways are still going to thrive and come back roaring. The reason being the promise of this space is too big for the desire to invest not to still be there.
Yeah, and as soon as we move a little bit farther beyond speculation and utility,
so I think
mixing
as
together.
regulation, we'll see what regulation does. We'll see what the cycle does, and I think it's going to be an and story, right? I've never been one of those people that thought like DeFi kills regular fi. Like no, it's all going to be an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And the world needs more forms of formation of capital. We don't need less, right? And so I think it's probably an and story for a long time.
Yeah. I would say for me, what gets me more excited is that people are able to really dream again. And at least for what we're building, there's a sense of abundance that we're trying to instill, specifically with our community. One of the things I also share a lot with people I talk to is that there's going to be a transfer of wealth, for a lot of people who missed out in the .com era as well. For example, I was in tech as a technical recruiter for many years, and the main issue we're trying to solve was how can we diversify the pipelines, right? And it's a very difficult problem to solve. And I think it's going to take a long time to solve that problem. And so what I'm very excited about with Web3 is that because this is not being led by America. It's actually being led by a lot of emerging markets. And so there's going to be a transfer of wealth to those emerging markets, right? And they're going to be able to lead with the innovation and give us case studies that we have never really seen before. And I also feel, that there's going to be just a lot of products that we can also look at those different emerging markets. So I'm really excited about that. And I think further is that, if we are able to succeed, right, it's really going to just change the game on how just nation states are formed, right? What Uwazie says a lot of times is that we need 1,000 of these at least to see 1 or 2 come out, right? And right now there's a dashboard of about 23. So I'm excited to also speak to other people who are thinking of this idea and talk to them, because a lot of people in our community are like, for the first time, like, I'm excited about something. I'm excited to join this vision. I think it's going to be a true testament to what a community can do and build over time.
Yeah, I think we promised big ideas on this panel, and I think we delivered some big ideas on this panel. I've learned a lot. So Chika, Amanda, Lule, I appreciate you guys taking the time to teach me as a newbie in this space. Really, I think I'm the newest one on this panel, but I hope everybody else got a lot out of that too. So thank you for taking the time to educate us all.